Tonight we have I was going to say we have a very special guest, but he's not really that special. I mean, he's here all the time. So, and his name is Mark Lovik. It's not Lovik. It's not lovesick. It's not love. Okay, it's Lovik. All right. So get it right, Mark Lovik. And I was speaking to him outside, and this really has nothing to do with the talk he's going to give, but Mark has a PhD in chemistry. And I don't understand why he doesn't insist on people calling him Dr. Lovik, because if I had a PhD, I would make my mother call me Dr. Lee Dumond. But he's humble like that, so. And he's going to talk today about WinRT development with HTML5 and JavaScript. And that's one of the things I love about Mark's talks, and that's one of the things we all love about Mark's talks, is that he always likes to get in on the cutting edge stuff, the latest stuff, the newest stuff, and kind of bring it all to us and give us an overview of it. This is all stuff we're going to be working with within a matter of weeks or months. So pay attention, because if you don't pay attention now, you'll have to learn this stuff later on your own time. And one of the great things I love about Mark, too, is that unlike all you kids, I'll say, okay, most of you kids, and if you're under 45, to me, you're a kid. Mark and I are kind of contemporaries, and we were kind of chatting outside, and we have a lot of interesting parallels. We both started out as musicians. I was a musician, and I was kind of a studio rat guy, and he was a musician, and got a bachelor's degree in music. And my bachelor's degree is in economics. Now, the other thing, too, is you kids, okay, that work in the computer industry, probably your degree is in computer science, right? Right, Andrew? Right.
He was a student.
Back in our day, there was no such thing as a degree in computer science. It didn't exist. So the people our age who work in this industry all have degrees in liberal arts or some other such. Economics. This is really one step above sociology. It's mostly quite frankly. But anyway, I hope you can beep stuff, can't you? Okay, thank you. All right, and some other interesting parallels. We both, the first program I ever wrote was an assembler on a PDP-8, a DEC PDP-8, and Mark's first program was on a PDP-11, which was the next model up from that. And this was a computer that was about the size of this podium, and that was considered a portable computer. And it had little switches on the front, and then you had to, and one up was a 1 and down was a 0, and it was 8 switches across, so that was a byte. And then you hit the last one, and then that registered the byte. And if you got one wrong, if you got the position of one switch wrong, you had to start all over from the beginning. And then we got paper tape. That was great, because once you got it all right, you could just punch it into a tape. And of course, Fortran, Pascal, C, assembler. These are all languages that I've written programs in, that Mark's written programs in. But now he works for IDOT as a private consultant doing MVC line of business applications. And that's pretty much what I do. I'm a private consultant. I do mostly MVC line of business apps with lots of client-side enhancements and improvements with JavaScript and so forth. And that's really what he's going to be talking about tonight. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Dr. Mark Lovik, not Lovik. Dr. Mark Lovik, here you go. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right.
Sometimes you can be humble if there's good reasons to be humble. Every time I think something good is going to happen, I find reasons to screw it up. So, but hopefully that won't happen tonight. Tonight we have an opportunity for me to do something as a deep dive into something brand new. And the problem is, for a deep dive is, this is so new in so many areas that it's kind of like drinking from a fire hose. You know, so imagine a dog drinking from a fire hose, getting blasted, crawling away, thinking about it, and then trying again. Well, that's kind of what we do sometimes as developers. And I've been doing it quite a bit lately. And so there's some things that right now I won't say I'm perfect at. One of the things that I would have to say is that not only am I not perfect with it, there's some humiliating aspects. Like, for example, I thought I knew JavaScript. Yeah, okay. There's a big difference of doing scripting with JavaScript and really starting to use this for full-fledged enterprise-level programs. And I think there's some issues, and I'll have a summary with this at the end, because JavaScript as an enterprise-level programming language traditionally hasn't happened. So today, though, we get the opportunity. And there's this language jargon, there's everything else hitting, but it's cool because we're living in interesting times. So I'm going to be talking about WinRT. That was the term I used. Now, the favorite term is Windows 8 Web Store apps, right? That's the new one that came. So it was Metro. Then it went to Modern UI. That was lame. And now we're not even talking about the UI. We're just saying where it comes from. It's a web store app for Windows 8. But that's what we're going to be talking about. And I'm going to be talking about HTML and JavaScript as a programming approach. So for the programming system, formerly known as Metro, formerly known as Modern, not really Windows RT, well, that's what we're going to talk. So, interesting times. Remember, it was Metro, then it became Modern UI. Now it's the App Store app. Okay, that still seems lame. I'm sorry, there ought to be a good term for this eventually. Then we have WinRT, that's our platform. They took what we're used to, the Win32 API and then the net on top of it, and now it's WinRT. Of course, we also have Windows RT, which is that ARM version of Windows for Windows 8 that's a completely different beastie. So we have to keep track of this once in a while. And then the thing that I think is scary is JavaScript for app development. Say what here means that seems scary, doesn't it? Because a lot of times when you see things in JavaScript, I get the image of poking and playing. Nothing seems to work because you can't figure out the language. And there are ways to make this work, but the thing is we're going to have to change. Also, you can use the classic form. When I first got into Windows app, there's a classic form of the start bar that's not there. So I got into Internet Explorer and I couldn't figure out how to shut it down, so I just pulled the plug. Darn. So Windows is different, and if you can't understand how to use Windows, you're not going to be able to figure out how to program this thing, and there's going to be a paradigm shift. So I guess what I'm getting in, there's a lot of changes, and if you go with the flow, there's some wonderful things going to happen. That's interesting times. At the same time as what you're used to is gone. But I think that's for the good, and so this transition might be uncomfortable. So these massive user interface changes means that if you want to go to Windows 8 and you think you're going to be productive instantly, don't count on it, because I thought I would too. And if you think about supporting other users that are used to doing Windows and they have troubles going from Windows XP to Windows 7, this is going to be a much bigger jump. The other thing that I found disconcerting for a while is now, and there's a reason for it, there's a lack of visible discovery. We've always had scroll bars, these things that they're calling now Chrome. So the things that we used to have, like scroll bars and big menus and things, they're not there. They don't even show up on the screen, so there's some habits you have to know. If you don't know those habits, you're in pretty bad trouble. Like I remember the first time I ever saw a Mac, I hated it. They just put me in front of the Mac and said, go, it's so intuitive, you won't have a problem. I've been programming Unix for years. I knew everything to do with the Unix machine, and then I couldn't figure out how to get to a console. I couldn't figure out how to do anything, and they said, oh, you have to click it. What's that? Okay, same difference though. We're having a paradigm change. So, line of business apps. I personally right now don't think we're ready for line of business apps. Microsoft's working very hard, but I believe that Microsoft is deadly serious, and it won't be for want of trying, and there'll be some things I'll talk about at the very end. So this is something that Microsoft is pushing hard. It's not just a game, it's not just playing around, but they're working hard at it, and there will be some implications of some things that I think will evolve over time. So this is just an introduction then. So the agenda, I want to talk a little bit about Windows 8, as little as I can get away with. Talk a little bit about Windows RT development, the different styles and ways we can do it, and the different approaches we can use. And then the focus then will be WinJS. And WinJS is the platform over WinRT, and it's the Java adapter, so we can program. We basically have an Internet Explorer kind of thing to get the DOM, and we have this WinJS to get the operating system junk, and that's what we use to build applications. Now, if we made a web type of application where you navigate from page to page to page and did a page load, that would look lame. So really where things are going to go is we're going to have to use a single page approach. And that's something that on the web people have been pushing with, and there's lots of different approaches. But web developers have traditionally been using web pages, and they've been going successively more enhancements. That's going to shift now to the stage of full immersive single page kinds of approaches if you want to get this type of real immersive interface type of experience and you don't want the extra clutter. So I'm going to give you a couple of Hello World programs, and we're going to kind of slowly introduce the idea of JavaScript programming using WinJS. And this is straight from Microsoft. I decided, why invent something when you can grab the actual sample yourself? And then I decided, I had a couple of lame examples. If you ever see a calculator thing in there, I started, but it's not within the style or the flavor of where they aimed this originally. So I shifted, and I decided to make an SVNUG presenter, one that just displays all the videos of this last year. And it's hardwired, but the thing is, it's a good approach in terms of how you want to develop a project. Often you want to play with the interface, and then you maybe want to play otherwise in terms of getting your data or your services layer. And so this is one where I've stubbed the equivalent of the services. I did some screen scraping to get some information, and then I've hardwired it, but it's going to be easier to understand how it fits together. And then later on, once you know the interface, you can tie it all down. You can be working, let's say, on going to YouTube, and then getting their API, and then finding ways to consistently suck that data down so you can have discovery. And actually, from where I'm at from an app to the stage of a discoverable app is not that big a jump. So that's what we're going to see, and the reason why is this is probably one of the core kinds of ideas. If Microsoft wants to get consumer-grade types of applications, where often they're very webbish, they're very interactive, and that type of developer hasn't been the traditional line of business app developer. Okay, so this application, I think, at least hits that, and it was the simplest one I could figure out, and I was able to hack this out within about 12 hours, which I was pretty happy with, including sleeping a little. Okay, so for the environment. If you haven't seen it before, go to electronics store or something. The modern interface looks very different. And the best way to think about this is your start bar, except now it's a start screen. So think about a tablet, and on a tablet right now, having little buttons as they get smaller and smaller really doesn't make sense. So if you get to a phone or whatever, they want a consistent UI, and what's happening is if you scroll down to the bottom left part of the screen on a touch screen, we don't have one, you can actually toggle between modes and get all sorts of things, but usually what they want to do is they want to swipe. You swipe from the left, you swipe from the right, you swipe from the bottom to get like certain things, or you swipe from the top. And if you do it with a mouse, it works reasonably well. If you do it from a keyboard now, it's reasonably well. Like I was really frustrated, how do I do things? Well, on a start bar, if you want to start an app like DEVENV, if you want to get Visual Studio, that's the way I do it all the time. I just type it so fast I don't think about it. But you go to the start bar and you go run. Cool part here is, and this is the paradigm that was so frustrating, you just get in the start screen and start typing. So if I start typing that, it'll find it and you just hit enter. Lack of discovery, right? Before we were used to, you go to that start bar thing and it would prompt us to what we want. Right now is they're trying to pull this out, so they don't want Chrome. Well, if we want to go to the classic interface, we have, sorry, I screwed up. The classic interface, you can get the normal screens with frames and everything else, but the idea of a scroll bar, really Microsoft's trying to stay away with. The idea of having different page with page frames, those are all Chrome. It's not the content, it's now the things we put content in. We can still do this, but what's disconcerting is a lot of your standard keyboard commands are different now. They're really better, but you're going to have to unlearn a lot of things, and unlearning is sometimes the worst learning of all. So you can flip between these, but count on you're going to be flopping back and forth between that start screen with all the, with all the tiles, having charms and doing things that way with that stuff on the right to be able to do your settings, and then toggling between classic mode. Now, if you're on a Windows RT system, that modern interface is just it. And on modern interface, you can have a couple different approaches. If you have a full screen app, you can have it in portrait or landscape. If you have like a tablet and desktop, usually it's not going to flop for you much. But you can also sit there and drag things down to the right, and if you do, what you see in this right sidebar is something that's snapped. So that's a snap state for an app, and most of the time it would be nice if a snap state does something useful, like if you had a calculator. So one of the examples I was going to do is a calculator, and they have it so it still would function the sidebar, because when you do a calculator full screen, you look and go, whoo, because it's really, really big. The buttons are, you know, the size of Rhode Island. But you get two screens in modern, right? You get the snap form, you get the filled form, or everything's full screen, and you notice there's no navigation, there's no anything else. You keep going to the bottom left corner to be able to get and select things in terms of your charms. Okay, for Windows RT development, we have two kinds of tools. Visual Studio 12 is the base form you're going to have to use, and I like the dark color scheme now. I'm getting kind of enamored with it. Might change my mind next week. And there also is Blend, and I was so excited. Visual Studio has Blend. I can do web apps in Blend. Well, if you have the Pro and those types, I don't know what the upper level does. I think it did, like the Ultimate and such, but Blend just works for Windows Store apps. But still, that's kind of cool. And it also means that if you do a Windows Store app with C# and XAML or another net language in XAML, you can use Blend. But Blend also now works with HTML. Interesting. Now, if we think about programming, we can do things now with C++. They have made C++ a full-fledged language. And the real thing to think about C++ here is there's two different forms of display. There's a XAML, and this is unmanaged code. There is no runtime. This is straight. You're going to have to do garbage collection yourself, everything else, where you knew in your free memory. Very low overhead. It's a more verbose language than like C# or some of the other options you've got. But with C++ and XAML, you can make a very terse program, or you can make good components that are very lightweight. And you're directly over the WinRT runtime. Now, besides XAML, you can also do DirectX directly. Think games. So they're trying to make an engine now that will be pervasive for games on PCs and on tablets. And that, I think, is very interesting and very compelling. And from a component standpoint, all those companies that want to do components, well, JavaScript in some respects, if they want to simplify it, they'll give you very large, very chunky components. A web developer who really doesn't want to dig into the depths of some of what we're even going to see very quickly could probably do things with API development. So I think that for companies doing tools, this is a wonderful place to start looking. And Microsoft's all excited, and I think that there's going to be a lot happening. Not sure where it's going to go. Personally, I'd rather stay away from C++. I've done enough of it. We obviously have the net runtime, and over WinRT, if you notice, C++ is straight on the WinRT API. We have an adapter. We have a netish kind of thing. And the reason why I'm saying netish is they've changed a little bit of the assemblies and things you go to. But pretty much is you're programming C# the way you're used to with an API that is very similar but not quite the same. And you have a XAML that's very close to the XAML you're used to with Silverlight or with WPF. And I think is a very expressive form. So you notice C++, if it was a tool for JavaScript, uses XAML. And if you're doing things in net, you're doing XAML. And then you have JavaScript. Okay, and JavaScript uses HTML and CSS for the same things XAML would do. Going back, the net form, we really have a lot of programming paradigms and things we're finally getting used to, where a lot of the habits you would do in Silverlight, like using kind of a Prism or composite application guidance for Silverlight, or boy, I'm just freaking out on this, WPF. I programmed in that for years now, and I can't even think of it. We have a lot of ways to control things, model, view, model. And there's ways to build large-scale applications. And that's one of the things I personally found so frustrating is we're going to trade that for JavaScript? Because right now, XAML does a good job being expressive. It has two-way binding, it has some wonderful binding capabilities, and we've learned how to control C#, get things to the database, and right now there's going to be some different changes and probably more of a push for services, because in the case of like tablets and other types of mobile computing, a service interface layer makes more sense than direct to a database. Because you're not going to hook and go in through wireless probably straight to your database on a portable device. You might. But now when we're doing things, if we're doing a webbish kind of app using JavaScript, HTML, and CSS, okay, the CSS is going to be the styling and that kind of thing, which often is done in XAML, and you can compartmentalize it and isolate, and that's often done. We have HTML, which is going to express the elements, you know, the DOM parts and pieces and all the traditional things we're used to. And then JavaScript is going to be the programming system behind it, and that is the major programming system behind it. And when you're doing it, we're going to hit two interfaces. Straight below, you go to WinJS. It's the adapter that's JavaScript-centric to go to the WinRT API. So we ain't talking to Win32, we're talking to this WinRT through WinJS. At the same time is Internet Explorer is kind of embedded back in there in the background, and they're working on optimizing the heck out of it, and there's huge amounts of work to make that much faster and to make the JavaScript compilation and running process much more efficient and much faster. So you're really programming to the DOM through like an IE in the background, and you're programming to WinRT. This is a different paradigm, and if you're thinking about single-page applications, it might be the closest. In single-page applications, there was a paper I saw that was wonderful that says there's really two types of approaches for doing things in JavaScript. There's a library approach, and there is, besides a library approach, there's a framework approach. And when they're doing this, they're sometimes doing things as string templating. So when I talked about MVC back when, it's string templating. You go on the server, and what are you doing? You're taking your database, you're taking all your HTML markup, you're mushing it all together, and you're just generating straight HTML. And so it's more of a stringifying kind of thing. Here what's happening is if we can set things up more DOM-ish, that seems to be the approach that's going to be happening for single-page applications, and it looks like it's the one that Microsoft's using pretty heavily. They want you to program directly in the DOM and then use the DOM elements and DOM efficiency changes to start getting you faster and faster apps without you optimizing it. Different way of thinking about it. But it turns out we still haven't figured out single-page applications, and there's not unity in the industry. So if you're a web developer and you're using Backbone or you're using Meteor or you're using lots of the different frameworks that are out there, you know, there's 10, 20 you can talk about. A lot of these frameworks may not make sense here in this system because you'd be replacing what Microsoft's supporting. Well, the other thing is client-server is a lot different now because with this WinRT API, you can talk to things directly. But they have made it similar in some respects to what you're used to. There's an idea of a session if you want it. Why? Because it's comfortable to web developers. And we can store state in some very similar forms. Okay, so for WinJS development, said it before, Visual Studio, Blend, you need to use Visual Studio 12. They now have IntelliSense, and you can debug straight in JavaScript, which if you couldn't would be a disaster. You have to have Windows 8. You know, Windows 7 and emulator sounds great, but they don't do it. If you don't have Windows 8, all those little templates and things to give you the App Store apps won't happen. And if you have a machine that's less than 13, I think it's 66 pixels wide, you can't do that snapping and some of the standard operations. You can only go full screen. Lately, I just purchased a touch monitor that's a 1080p monitor that's 23 inches. It's wonderful, but I'm sitting there and I'm moving my hands, you know, in large motions to do those things. It would be very natural. Curious to see what's going to happen on that, because somebody was talking about Microsoft had like Surface shown off where they were having motions that, you know, 2-3 feet for things that could be swiped on a little pad. You also have to have Intel architecture machine for development, and you can tether and remote it into other machines, and I would love to test that, Keith, today, if we get a chance later, but that would be after the talk. Okay, so App Store isn't necessary for classic mode, so your old apps can still go on Windows 8 the way they used to. They're not going to be Metro apps, though. If you have a Metro app or something from WinRT, it's going to have to go through the App Store. So one of the first things that I won't be able to show you today is when you first start development on anything, you have to get a key. And your key, unless you're on the App Store, is for a month. And if you get in the App Store and actually get registered in the App Store, you get a key for longer than a month. But the whole idea is you're getting apps for testing purposes. And I believe that there's a corporate deployment option, so you can build apps and keep them internally without the App Store. Don't know how that works. I've just heard about it. And the developer license time for testing. But otherwise, you have to put it on the App Store. And remember, if you put it on the App Store, then you can use it under Windows RT, the ARM stuff, or the Intel stuff, desktop or otherwise. And the cool part is it's very, very fast. And I might try and use the App Store real quick if you haven't seen it at the very end, if you're curious, but not part of the talk. Okay, hello world. If you have an initial solution, this is very similar to what we're used to with a Solution Explorer. Couple things that are different is if you do a stock single page kind of hello world application, I'm not even going to demonstrate it. You're going to have CSS for your styling. You're going to have images for where you want to put all your standard images and a nice stock path. This is just defaults. The JS folder is going to be where you're going to put JavaScript. Now there's different organizations when you start using some different templates, and then pages is an idea that if you're web development, you might sit there and if you want to do a page, you make an HTML form. Or if you're doing Razor types of development, you do a CS/HTML, and each one of those is a distinct view or subview that you're going to work in your system. A page, most of the time, if you do a page and add it, it's an HTML and a CSS and a JavaScript file. There's 3 files developed all at the same time with the same name and kind of all set up. And so they're making this idea of you have views of things with the programming, the style, and then the elements all into a triple file. So a page really is just those 3 components, CSS, JavaScript, and HTML. And then down at the bottom, very, very important, notice there's that temporary key, right? When that key expires, it's not going to work, and in general, you're not going to put it on somebody else's machine, except with a temporary license. There's also a package app manifest. That's a very important piece because it does capabilities. Now if we want to talk, and I'm not showing this today, but if we wanted to have, the first thing that I would want to add on this is maybe be able to do a search to find the videos we want. If we do that kind of thing, we need to put that capability for doing a search into this package app manifest. So we could just type and all of a sudden search would be there. Without it, it's not going to happen. That's a different idea. We always before have had to put in search in some place, put in all the visual cues. Now we just put in the search capability and expose it in the manifest. We're ready to go. Okay. Less important here since I've already talked about it, but again, that idea of a page, the 3 parts, is important. Now for a demo. And by the way, look at my little quote. Think about it for a minute. You better all get this. Okay, thank you. Yes. Okay. Instead of my lame tutorial, Microsoft has a wonderful Getting Started series of things, and I would recommend going there, and it's going to be a little overwhelming. The Getting Started JavaScript tutorials here, the first one I have is Hello World Part 1. And if we go and run this, it's not going to be very impressive. What's your name? It's not. Wow, right? A couple of things are going to have to happen here. First of all is we're going to have an event handler, right? We're going to have a click handler. And at the end, that hello Ralph has to be displayed somehow. Nice little simple thing, but notice the program has no boundaries, no Chrome, no anything. So this does hit under it, but there's not much here. But if nothing else, it gets us started to see what we have to do. Ah, darn. I need my glasses here. Most of what we're going to have, this is a single page type, and we have a default.html, and since it's a single page, in the JS we're going to have a default.js, and in CSS we're going to have a default.css. Wow. Most of this in the CSS looks pretty common, right? We have selectors and things, and so like header class, main content class, where we're just setting up some attributes to see how the display works. Down below there, there's these media things, and if I get a little time at the very end, I could play with this and show you how it works. But the bottom line is, if we're in that snap mode, when you move it over to the side, or if we're in that filled mode, that's the other part of Snap. So if you have just a two-screen app thing, the big part of the screen is going to be in the filled. Then we have full screen portrait and full screen landscape. Each of these we can set up separate styles. And so it's pretty easy to sit here and I can make a style, and there was a bottom piece of text in that example, and I've changed the color when you go into Snap mode and we go, oh wow, I'm not worthy. But that's a very important thing, because remember, our apps have to hit under different form factors. And so you can run either in a simulator, you can actually emit straight to a simulator. So right now, as I'm local machine, if I go in here from local machine and I change to a simulator and I go and run things, yeah, I did that right. Okay. It said it was on a local machine. Make me a liar. I give up. It might mean the simulator doesn't work on this screen, because I did it a bunch before on my machine at home. Bummer. But there is a simulator. It'll pop up a little window, and you can play with different aspect ratios. You can play with different resolutions. Stock resolutions of like the 1366, 768, and you can go up to 19.2 resolution, and you can play around with different forms. Well, since that didn't work, in terms of default.html, not much that's exciting. Notice we have a title. This is very webbish, very, very webbish. Doc type HTML. What type of HTML is that? I had 4 or 5 people say, right? 5. Nice part about this is we get IntelliSense in the HTML. And so it's very important to spec which kind of HTML you're using. You also notice here in the drop-down, which would have been the other hint, of what kind of HTML you're using. So by default, these apps use HTML5, and you will get IntelliSense, because now you have a stricter form than just, yeah, it's HTML and go guess, which is what it used to be. One difference is we have WinJS references. I could change UI from light to dark on this screen, and it would be dark. I think you'll believe me, but if you really want to see it and doubt me, we can go do that. This is a little different from what we've seen for an href, because we have this Microsoft.WinJS namespace, and that's going to be often a common way to get hold of either styles that are set up. In this case, under the references, under the Windows library, we have UI dark, we have UI light. Under the common information, then we have a base.js. If we look at that, we go, I haven't even gotten very far. Lots and lots and lots of stuff, right? So what's happening is, by default, when we get an app, we're going to reference this base.js library. A very important library, need to dig through it. I haven't gotten that far right now, but it turns out that's going to be where you get an awful lot of your resources available, and a lot of the things that the wizards go through will be assuming that this library is available. There's some UI stuff, not terribly important right now. What I would like to focus though here is let's go look at the default.js. Let's see a couple of things. First of all, if we look at the very top, we have something called WinJS.application. A lot of the WinJS things, and whenever you think WinJS, remember that's the interface over the WinRT, which means we're getting to the system. So WinJS.application is our application thingy to get a hold of a lot of the resources that are available in the system. And then there's, under Windows application model, activation, there's this activation thing. We're going to see it very quickly. There's this onActivated function. WinJS strict processing, a lot of times JavaScript is not that terribly strict, but we're going to assume a tighter constraint in terms of what kind of JavaScript we're supporting to make sure it becomes a little bit more controllable, because there's a lot of things in JavaScript that are darn well dangerous. New becomes possibly one of them, but there's many constructs that are terribly unwise. Well, one of the things that's going to happen is we have different states on launch. Whenever we start things up, there are different states innate within a Windows application where we can start up the first time, or we can start from a suspended state. So we can go from running to suspended back and forth. So if you're doing an app and another one covers it over, it's not gone, it's just been suspended. Now, you can keep doing this app after app after app, but sooner or later, if you run out of memory, then Windows will make a decision, probably one of those first to drop. But it eventually will say, I don't like that, we'll dump it. So depending on what happens, you may be starting under any different conditions, and so you have a way to look at on the startup to say, well, what was my previous execution state? And so you're going to start up, use your application in this kind of form. And whenever you see something like set promise, I'm not going to go into all the details, but like this process all says we're going to do some things, but a promise means usually that's going to be happening asynchronously. Remember, our eventing model now is when we set up long-lived things, or if we have callbacks for anything that might be long-lived, you're going to be doing things asynchronously. So if you ever see promise, think about that kind of idea. Well, here's another thing that I found disturbing when I first saw this. See this document GetElementById? When I first looked at that, I went, ooh. If a lot of you have done web work, the reason why is I think jQuery, right? jQuery, got to get jQuery. And GetElementById, that's JavaScript. You can use jQuery, but in a lot of respects, Microsoft is saying, why would you want to? Because often that's to resolve all the differences between all the different browsers in the world. And there's tremendous amounts of code to be able to do that, and they're saying that's inefficient. So do you really want jQuery? Darn it, I do. But so you can put jQuery in, but the thing is, Microsoft is right now promoting their examples most of the time. You're just going straight in and you get element by class, get element by AD, that kind of idea. So for a lot of web people who are really onto jQuery, ugh. And then here, this is very simple. We have a hello button, add listener. We have a click event, and we have a click button handler, and I'll just tell you, some of the IntelliSense makes this much better, but this sounds pretty good. When we start up, we're starting from suspended, or we're starting from the other one, and right now we're not doing anything with the state. Hello World 2 will actually do a little bit of stateful stuff, and we're just going to look at it pretty quickly. But we add this event listener because otherwise we can't do anything, right? That's our click button handler. And realize that how button handlers are done with in Java is a little bit different than it's done in, let's say, C# and some of the systems we've been used to. There's another thing here that's not being used, the OnCheckpoint. If we ever suspend, we really want to keep track and dump our data into place and keep doing snapshots. Kind of like program droppings, you know? Imagine on a trail and we do droppings so we can find our way back. Well, these program droppings are checkpoints for restoration. And then we have our button handler, and basically we just have an event. And remember that Java is, or JavaScript is an untyped language, very dynamic. So you don't see much in types. You see things like var characters and things. So what we're doing is we get elements by ID, and this NameInput is an ID that we would have seen on the screen. I would say if we go back to the HTML element, we see that div element, and it was under where we had our type the name. And what we're doing is we find that name, we grab it, or sorry, that actually was the input field. We go grab it, then we append a greeting string, and then we get the greeting output, and we stuff it into the actual HTML, right? So if we went back to the default.html, what do we have? We have a name input and a greeting output. Name input is an input with an ID, of name input. The div has an ID of greeting output. So really in our JavaScript, we have to go find those elements. Find the right one, right? We use the name input, we go grab it, right? So we have to go navigate and find it. Now this paradigm, sometimes I find disturbing. Like if you want to do a message, little pop-up messages and things, what you do is you get a template for all the different message types for how the pop-up's going to look on the screen. And it turns out what they do is they give you a template. You traverse through it and find out the right places to stick your information, and then you shove the whole template with the data back in. That sounds really efficient, doesn't it? But it's a DOM-ish kind of thing, right? You traverse, go find what you need, go manipulate with your element, and when you're all done, you then go, after you've done your manipulation, you might move the data to something else, you go find that element. That seems to work really well in this type of environment, but now in the C# environment, you're doing that with XML traversal and things within structures, or XAML traversal. And I don't know if that's necessarily efficient. I would have just said, well, if it's a template, go ahead and just stuff your data in it. Now, if you modify your template, that makes sense, but these are read-only templates. You can do everything, you can put the data in, but you can't change them. So they're just putting the data in, and you're just having to traverse through all this junk just to find out where your input fields are. Go figure. And then you notice here, the button click handler, these are functions. This app start just goes, right? So what's happening is when you load the page, you start running this JavaScript automatically. The functions there are defined, they're ready to go, but the app start is run. So if you're not used to JavaScript, that's a little strange. The other thing you will see in most things is you will see in all the Microsoft examples this function thingy. The reason why they're doing this is primarily for scope. You could almost think about this as either a scope resolution or kind of like an object right now in terms of, I'm just trying to give you an idea about this. But this idea of function means everything between the braces is now somewhat private. Use strict means we're going to constrain a little bit of our JavaScript, and we're going to use the ECMA5 standard instead of some of the older stuff. And it means that these applications are becoming a little bit more private, and then we're going to have these functions, and they're actually exported. So it actually works in communication. It's almost like you're building yourself a class. You can think about it, not right, but it's close. You're building a class, you set up your private data, you have functions that can access the data, and it persists and is around. Okay? This habit you will see pervasively in this code. Okay. Not terribly exciting, but now if we go to the next case, if we go to Hello World Part 2, all the code is the same, except for the default.js. And the difference here, this all looks the same, right? We got the same start where we're basically building our app object, we do an activation to figure out how we got started, and we have this onActivated. When the program starts up, we get an event, and it starts rolling everything up. And on this onActivated, we have this execution state, and here's the interesting thing with IntelliSense, right? With like terminated here, we can see our states. We have terminated, we have suspended, we have running. Cool. That was never available before in Visual Studio, and that kind of IntelliSense is absolutely wonderful, and sometimes gives you a hint of how to work through things. But now here, if you remember before, you just had clean startup and there was nothing here before. Now we're having this output value equals WinJS application session state greeting output. When you see this, a lot of web developers are used to session state, right? Session state here is the same kind of idea. We're kind of storing some session data that should be persisting over time. And it's just a thing called greeting output. So if you think about the Razor type of syntax and things with kind of like a bag of data or something, that's what this is primarily, as kind of a best approximation. And what's saying is, if you have an output value, the next line down, and by the way, be very careful because how JavaScript compares things is so much different that that's something you really need to look at because you can get hurt. But if there is an output value, that we pulled out of session. In other words, if we're restoring there's some session information, we're going to grab this in and have the greeting output so we could actually hold it. So between when we start and when we end, we would actually have all our data going. Okay. Then at the end, a couple of other things you have to do. There's restoring settings, right? Application data, current local settings. And then we can pull out this username is set up in local settings. So we have a local settings data and we have a session data. This is kind of very much web-ish. I'm ignoring persistence right now, but if you notice, if somebody's in a web programming paradigm and they're used to this kind of idea, a lot of the constructs you're used to are there. Very different form because this is not a web app. This is a program. And then on Checkpoint, well, remember we said you have to do your little program drop. It's on Checkpoint now. You have Getelementbyid. We're grabbing our greetings output periodically, and then we do a greeting output, and we store that information then in our session state. Okay, that makes perfect sense. So we keep saving it. We can also restore it. So if we ever get suspended, we can then keep popping it back. Gives us our persistence. We still have our click event. Yeah. Notice that when we do some things that change, we tend to save our local settings and change them and modify them dynamically. So we have the session information, we have that user setting. A little bit difference in terms of lifetime and how long they're used. Okay, this is about as simple as example as you can start seeing. So we have a click event handler, we have saving and restoring some settings, and we have some persistence. And from a web standpoint, very, very similar. No, I don't care about that. Okay. And again, I've got a reference to where you can get the code examples, and there's a tremendous amount of available information. John, when you were programming, is that your primary source that you went to? Okay. So remember, different from normal programs where we normally control the lifetime and they're always stuck in the main program bar and things. You now have application states where you have running suspended, packs, goes back and forth between there, and if you run out of memory, it can go terminated when you least expect it. There tends to be a tendency to keep things in memory unless you explicitly close it down. And I kept wanting to close down programs. The other thing is, if you have like a Surface or some sort of tablet kind of device, often you just kind of turn the whole darn thing off. You never turn off programs and things. So it's a very different form, and normally they're going to give you a little bit of time to be able to save your state, and those will be through events. But this is going to be very much an eventing system. Storage, I already talked about some of this, right? You can stuff things in the DOM if you want to. That's an old web-ish kind of trick, but that's very transient. The page goes, you're gone. Now, if we're doing single page kinds of things, it would have to be in your container, right? Because if a page goes away, the state with the page is gone. But now, what I want to talk about is, here's the little app, and I'm going to finish up on the app, and I'm actually not going too fast today. We have a pretty good start to a video library on YouTube. So I thought, cool, let's see if I can get something going. And so this was like Saturday night. I thought I'd be doing it because the other examples I did just really didn't fit the programming paradigm. So how about a presentation player app? So the eventual goal would be use the YouTube API, like the Atom kinds of stuff, or they've got a bunch of different ways you can pull off the data, and you can actually do searching dynamically. That would be perfect because we can have things discoverable. And because we do it in our own group right now, it would be easy to search and actually sequence in terms of dates and times. Perfect. The only thing we'd have to do that we're not doing on that API is we'd have to classify it in terms of what my program's doing right now. So what I did was I just did a screen scrape and then set up a prototype, basically linked and set it up. There's a lot of applications out there that do this form, and for a lot of the web-ish people, that's the first thing they're thinking about. Yeah, how can I grab something on the web and reassemble it and put it in a program? And in some cases, you have a very different user experience. So my approach was to keep the prototype simple and flexible, plus it's easier to demonstrate. If I had a feed and I was doing all the feed stuff, you wouldn't quite understand the data, very much too dynamic. So I hardwired dummy data. I love to do that. You can do dummy data, play with the API, see how you want to do it, shift your data forms. At the same time as you're looking at your database or persistence or your service mechanism and playing with it and trying to get that honed. And at the end, when you start hardwiring it, you set up your data structure at the end. Interface then matches what customers want. You can set everything up in terms of what it should look like. At the same time, you're designing the interface and getting user experience. You can actually work on the technology back end. And when you put it together, I've had good success where it just goes together instantly. I have rarely had a problem, and if it is, it's usually because I did something really silly. And the nice part is, a lot of times, it's not going to happen here, is you can separate GUI development from server development. So you think about one thing instead of the whole thing. And it's a lot faster from a GUI development standpoint just to look at it and say, what do I want to do, as opposed to all the details. Yes. So in Microsoft, this idea is content over Chrome, and they really want you to look at the user interface, but that's after you've gotten things roughly right. Now, the other thing about this is this application has really just 3 screens, and it's dynamically populating through data. So this is a data-driven application. It just hardwired data. So you have a default container page, and this is very common for most SPA applications, and you have some sort of div. In this case, it's called content host, but the whole idea is your outer default container has your JavaScript to do your general purpose overall things, and each page has its page-specific things. You could set this up with some sort of hierarchical view model if you want to, and you could actually attach them in, let's say, in terms of a content top-level view model for like navigation things. But realize normally you're displaying one thing at a time. You might have split view, but most of the time you have 1 or at most 2 views open in an application for the metro style. But in this idea, you can then have content pages. So you need some navigation, right? You're not going from page to page, but your navigation is going to be through a Navigator. And there's an idea of a page control Navigator. So the way I've got it is WinJS applications, your app. An added thing here is this WinJS navigation. We're going into this content piece. So we have an outlier piece in terms of just this common piece that's always there with this JavaScript and behavior. We're going to have this common data that gets shared in a consistent form that's pervasive through the application. So the data is always there, and we're going to go through, obviously, the WinRT environment. The other thing is for navigation, you need to have a history. Well, that's done for you, and it can get kind of ooky. And this is done through that nav.navigate kind of piece. So if you want to change things, you do nav.navigate, next element I want to go to. Next page, it goes, stuffs it in, does the history, reallocates where it's at, keeps track of a history for you. Very common to Silverlight. So if we look at the app then, I hope. Yeah, famous last words. I am trying. I was thinking I was in a Metro app. Whew. I've gotten so used to that. Don't want that one. Sorry, this one got blown away. First, to see the application. It's not that terribly exciting, and there's a bunch of images I could put in. I could put in search. A tremendous amount of things you can put in, but it does the core and the spirit of what we want. It has a little bit more of interest than a stock application. Compared to my laptop, this is a screamer. Okay, I have the simulator running. Yeah. First of all, as this is running the simulator, if I change the attributes, it would go full screen. And probably I'm going to have troubles doing that. But here's my little appy thing. And in this, I could use a, let's make me a liar, but no. Oh, there we go. Scroll bar would be like swiping left and right. And the whole idea on this is content over Chrome. As you notice, there are no scroll bars, really. You see one that kind of pops up when I scroll. Notice down the bottom of the screen, there's nothing until I scrolled, and it just shows up. There's very, very little in terms of Chrome. And the whole idea is we've got a couple different categories. Imagine we have lots and lots and lots of videos we need to find. First, we can see all the categories, and if we drill down the categories, we can see all of the instances. And it turns out these are our grouped instances. It would be nice to have pictures. Like I was going to do a screenshot, basically run the video and then do a zap of like, I don't know, one of my heads in terms of the video that didn't look too disgusting, or you know, do a screenshot so we have a picture of everybody who was a presenter. And then in terms of the categories, it'd be nice to have a category picture. Okay, but yeah, that's a lot of work right now, and right now I consider that fluff. So all of these should be diagrams or pictures, and if you don't want that, we could compress it and just turn it into text. Depends on what kind of extra superfluous things we want to help navigate, and what's a good mix between too much stuff or we want to compress things a little bit more. But we've got categories. I decided to go, we've got Azure. Well, gee, Sean, we could actually show you up in there or something. If we did this, there was only one instance, and by the way, my app isn't formatted terribly well, but this actually does play. What's it doing? It's just going to YouTube. Wow. But it gives a very different experience than going through YouTube, right? This is an app. Appish environment has to be connected, but now all of a sudden we would start playing our videos. And this actually does have sound and stuff, and away you go. So it has most of the normal controls. I don't have it, so it does full screen. There's a lot of formatting and nice things that could be done to this. But the whole idea is, should I keep going? If we wait a few more seconds, we'll start seeing a body. Yeah. Okay, that's bad enough. We're going to stop. But notice here, the whole idea is we're drilling down. This is a category that has one. Right? Azure, we have one. Hopefully by next year we'd have 2 or 3 or 4, but as you start getting more, the subcategories become important. So this is the idea of drill down. We drill down, we drill back. And notice what I've got in terms of Chrome in here. Besides this window, which is, pretend it's you know, some sort of tablet device, all we have is a button. Wow, that's it. Also, if you think about touch, a scroll bar doesn't work as well with touch as it goes smaller and bigger, smaller and bigger. A button that's large enough doesn't take much real estate, and it's good for navigation, so we're going by habit. Now, if we go into different categories here, we can scroll and just have to know you touch and swipe, or you use the mouse wheel if you got that set up, or in a keyboard you kind of play around and try and do goofy things. It doesn't work as well. If we went into database stuff, right, here we've got 2 examples here. So you notice this is category. I have a top level category. I have a group levels, just so we can drill down, so if you have too much information. So there's not quite as much use, but then this would also scroll if we wanted to. So here's the entity framework one that we could start displaying if we wanted to also. So that's all this app does. But if you notice, this would be a slick little app. And if anybody wants to volunteer for doing the graphics, I'm lame. And if somebody wants to help do the Atom, it's really not that tough, or there's a couple of other ways you can do the YouTube API, but to be able to screen scrape this is probably a couple hours of programming. It really isn't that tough. And then the advantage is if you build something like this, now you can have the resources and things that can be pulled down into a centralized form, and that could all be done with a very simple interface. This is the spirit of why JavaScript was originally developed, and this is what they're seeing as their first causes. Reader apps, shopping store apps, you know, things like that, or you know, little storefront apps and then reader apps, things like that. And a lot of this kind of form of an app is really the form where they're trying to pull web developers first. As you start getting more complicated, and this does have some complications, things will become possibly more difficult. Yes, here we go. On this, all I wanted to show is, if you see this, we have a default CSS, and then these pages are grouped together. Top level is my group stuff. I have group items, and I have item detail. So basically top level, middle level, bottom level. Those 3 screens is what you saw, and that's mainly the app. But here we're talking about rich apps for consumption of information. And on each of these, the thing that's most interesting is, first of all, the data, and then how we would all suck it in. So remember, we have this ubiquitous function-y kind of thing to make sure each page is unique. We don't have global crosstalk all over the place. Okay, and again, that's where I would recommend JavaScript, the good parts. Really spend some time. If you haven't gone through almost the entire book or its equivalent of information, anything like this is going to hurt yourself because there's so many frustrating things. Like you never use equal to compare things. Now I do because I cheat sometimes when I'm doing web apps, but it turns out that's just a recipe to hurt yourself because it's a compare and cast at the same time. And mere mortals usually don't know what that means because it's going to hurt you and do something strange. Use a triple equals, or you do a not double equals and things. This is not your traditional language. It doesn't have classes. You have prototypal inheritance, which is a very different thing, and it has a lot of language constructs that don't come from the C traditional types of forms. But basically what we're doing is we're making a binding list, and this is something we're storing. And there's a spot where it's being stored, but we're actually stuffing it in as a global object, and we're using the runtime parts. So I'm going to go through this pretty quick in terms of code. And then what happens is making the items and the groups, and this would be something if you're using an API, we use a query and we get the results and we'd assemble this all up, right? Big whoop. And then through here, we have a couple of functions, things like get item reference, get item groups, resolve group reference, resolve item reference. And this is just ways to go through this data structure. And the data structure here that's being generated, notice what's happening is my sample groups. I had a group one called Azure. What a great name. I basically sucked it out of the template and didn't change that because I was too lazy. Have a group of ASP.NET, and then little information. And if you remember, this is not a strongly typed language. When you want to build a class, you just go stuff things in. It's just key value pairs. That's it. So you notice here, we're going to make sure we match those key value pairs for every single element, or we're in trouble. And then sample items has basically the link and then the player. So you notice there's not much content, but we can get an app that does some wonderful things. And this is very similar to a lot of the applications you'll see on a phone or on an iPad and on everything else. It's a consumption style of app. And in some cases, it's very compelling. Like for my wife, she every once in a while gets really frustrated with those things that she doesn't know the different modes she got stuck in, and she just wants it to work. Well, this is the kind of thing that if you want to look at a news feed, great. If you want to just look at the SVNUG videos and nothing else, it makes it about as simple as possible, and there is value in something like this. Plus, it looks cool. I could go through in a lot of the detail, but you can debug, you can single step through here, and I could start showing you some things. If I went through like the navigation features and started going through the base class library, which I was doing a little bit today just for fun of it, there's an awful lot of ugly code in here. So if you get outside of the templates and forms that Microsoft has given you, this is a whole lot of hurt because it gets ugly. Because everything you've gotten used to for rich apps where you have to have callbacks and functions, and now think about asynchronous, and they made it simplified. It is very drastically simplified. You have hidden nothing of that away. So if you get outside of these templates, there's a lot you have to manage, right? Set up your event handlers, set up those promises so you have now asynchronous handlers, have the state management machine all set up. Not bad, but there's some ugliness. So there are some real issues in terms of how would you scale this to a rich line of business app. The other thing to think about is on normal web apps and web experience, people have gotten used to jQuery. You didn't see any because there's no jQuery references here. You can put in jQuery, but it's not a default out-of-the-box kind of experience. If you're used to jQuery UI, not going to happen. A lot of the platforms here that people are used to, often people are in sandboxes that are relatively incompatible with other people's sandboxes. Like recently, I've been doing some things with Telerik and like Kendo UI, and that's a whole JavaScript system you can program under. Very different from using somebody else's set of platforms and frameworks, and very different from this. So for web developers, if you go beyond the simple, and this is really a good tier to get started from, if we want to do these rich line of business apps, there's going to be a lot of work involved. Okay, moral of the story, and kind of finish this up because I didn't want to go too deep into this. And if you want to, I can show you a lot of the pieces in code later on. Set up where we were at. I'm going to skip a couple things just because it's nice and simple. In summary, if you think Microsoft isn't serious, now there's different camps in Microsoft, but Microsoft is deadly serious about this where they want JavaScript as a full-fledged with HTML programming system for Metro. They're allowing you to do C# and everything else, And Microsoft, I'm sure, is pragmatic. If nobody comes, it can be dropped like nobody's business. Microsoft tends to do that. There's a C++ style, there's a net style, and there's this style. But a couple things I want you to think about. First of all is JavaScript right now smells. I've used it a bunch, but everybody's used it as a scripting language. JavaScript can be robust and some language features that are wonderful. But JavaScript for large apps is kind of tough. And the people who do it, it's like, yeah, but real men program in JavaScript. They used to say it about assembler. I can program really well in assembler, but I'm not that dumb. But Microsoft's deadly serious, so we better give this a big consideration. The other thing, though, is web developers use a lot of incompatible JavaScript tools and frameworks. This is not like a web app. They've tried to make it web app-ish to make it simple and make it comfortable, but it's a very different beastie under the hood. But it's to give web developers that are outside Microsoft or sometimes in Microsoft tool chain to be able to get comfortable and maybe come into Microsoft, because this is a compelling environment, a very compelling environment. Mr. Crockford, who is a very well-established expert on JavaScript and has talked about the history, and if you get a chance to look at some of his videos, almost if you programmed a little bit in JavaScript and you're fairly comfortable with it, look at the videos first before you read some of his things, because there's a lot of things he'll tell you about in the videos that you can catch in terms of his perspective that doesn't go on paper very well. But as a translation, he said JavaScript is a language everyone uses before learning the language. That was true with me. I just hacked it up because it looks like C or Java or C# and close enough, and could cobble it to get it to work. But it is very, very different. And if you don't understand those differences, it will hurt you. But where I'd like to end up is there's something that came out October 1st, and it's called TypeScript. And if you hear about this, Microsoft has a large programming team, including some very, very, very big names. Okay, and they're in Europe and the States and everything else. But Anders has some nice talks about TypeScript, and the whole idea here is JavaScript's becoming ubiquitous, but a lot of parts are unsafe. And so there's been a lot of traditions in Google and a lot of other places to have subset languages that are safe. So it's just like JavaScript, but you only use the parts and you then have the parsers and things, so you can only do reasonable constructs. That's one force that's been happening. But if you think about the things we've been used to in net, we've been used to IntelliSense and tools and wonderful things where we can have all sorts of semantic and things where we can just go through all of this, where if we're in typeless form, it's not available. But yet JavaScript has some richness because of its dynamic types. And we've seen that now we have dynamic in C#. Well, if we want to make industrial tools and we've gotten used to it, why don't we do that to JavaScript? So the TypeScript idea has been going on for 3 years. They've had a team of at least 30 people going full force, and we're talking about high-level people that are hard to find that have been working on TypeScript. But it is to make, it's a superset of Java, and it emits Java is what it does. So you program in TypeScript, and it's like C#, where it has all the sorts of things you're used to in terms of type safety to make things on an industrial level. So if they've taken Anders and a number of these other people and pulled them out of the network that they've been doing for years and they've been doing this TypeScript stuff, they're serious about Java. The Internet Explorer is serious about Java. There's a tremendous amount of effort on this, and so if you aren't programming in it and you're doing metro applications, it's probably one of the things you should be doing in the future, just to be aware of the Java side of things, because who knows where it's going to go. But right now, I think programming in 2 or 3 years is going to be massively different. This, I don't believe, is ready for line of business. Microsoft's intending to do it, and they're giving the tools, so it will be stable for large line of business apps. So that's about it for a summary, and I did talk a little more slowly today. So thank you.
I do have one question. Testing. Sipwitz. Okay. You mentioned the the key that you had to get, the development key in order to build the apps? Is that, how does that work? Is that something that's just auto-generated by Visual Studio, or do you have to like?
When you're in Visual Studio the first time and you do an app, and you want to, before you run the app the first time, it'll give you a little alert box saying you've got to get a key, and you can get a temporary key. And so as long as you're connected to the internet, and if you have a live account, but for Windows 8 you usually have a live account to register for anyway, right? And then it just says, go get a key, and then it says you got a key for a month. Once you get in the App Store, they promise they give you a longer key. And John, do you know how long the key is for when you get the App Store key? Okay, they said longer, and I don't know what it is because I haven't bothered yet. But that's it. You just literally online. You just go and say click, and Visual Studio does it, and it's pretty transparent. They said, yep, you're blessed. You get that little key thing in there, and after a month, they go nag you again because it's happened to me.
Testing 1, 2, 3. Okay, Mark, this is a good talk. Had some questions for you around compatibility. So, of course, anyone that is familiar with JavaScript and HTML, probably the first question they're asking themselves is, if I use this platform and technology stack, what is the trade-off? How can I take existing code? For example, could I take Angry Birds that's available on the web, and can I take that and run that inside the WinRT technology stack?
You would have to port it.
So you would have to port it. Okay.
Well,
so
you could probably run things as a webbish kind of thing, but then the thing is, it's not really an RT app. So I mean, you could do pages with HTML and things and do it that way, but it's really not going to be that application. And as soon as it's an application, you're talking about a very different system. It's the tools, it's the technologies that you're mostly familiar with, but it is not the same web environment. So the thing is, you're not going to do a universal Metro app and then a single page application on the web, most likely.
Okay, so there's a follow-on question then. What I'm thinking is, okay, so let's say I'm part of that, and this doesn't apply to me in my case. I'm definitely a .NET developer, but let's say I'm part of the open source community, or I'm someone from the outside looking in, and I say, well, I can take these skills and I can apply them, but what am I getting out of it, though? I'm getting the Windows platform, but I already have wide accessibility across different platforms and devices when it's a website. So, I guess you could have the features that Windows adds, but what do you think the biggest, I guess I would ask, the biggest advantage? What is Microsoft offering these external developers?
I think part of this is going to be a promise, and it depends on a couple of forms of what's going to happen. They have now a tablet solution that can also be a full-fledged Windows solution, so it can be both, convertibles. And you're seeing devices that are an awful lot like that. But you notice we're getting walled gardens, and it's open source. You're starting to say, ew. Microsoft's doing a lot of open source when you get to like server tools and web stack. If you notice, so many things like Razor and everything else on that side is becoming open source. But we're getting the walled gardens. The Apple Store, Google's doing that, and then Facebook is really a walled garden. And then now we're getting it where Microsoft's saying there's money there. It's a walled garden. One advantage for an application developer, if you want to freelance, you can build applications now directly and stick them in the App Store. You don't have any front end. They're going to pull off, a percentage of it, but darn it, you have advantage. And not having tons of apps right now. Most of the calculator apps I've seen are pretty lame. They don't do in the sidebar well. They just don't have good behavior. It's early enough. You could even have a calculator app. I thought about it, and do I care enough? But you can write applications right now. This would be a free one, but there's ways to monetize. Now, if you start doing it with Azure as a service, you can have a rich experience that's going to be well above what you could have as a straight single-page web app in terms of speed and responsiveness. An example would be the Facebook app with Apple recently. If you remember, Facebook did the single-page kind of approach and was doing the webbish approach, and they finally gave up because there might be a lot of technical reasons, but they gave up and they were getting a speed increase of doing a native iOS kind of implementation. I would think that we have with the hardware that Microsoft's purporting to use, I think the minimum standard is going to be higher than that for the iPad because it looks like they're fairly performant devices that you should be able to do some real serious work on a tablet level at the same time as you can do in Office or something else. So the question is, what happens in the market? You also now have an alternative, but realize it's a walled garden.
So Mark, if I understand right then, so the call to action for developers is you will make money if you build an app for the Microsoft walled garden, and that in turn is dependent on Surface sales, Windows 8 phone sales. Would you say that's correct?
I believe so.
So we really want those sales to be good then for Surface.
Yes, we would want that. And the other thing right now is it doesn't even have to be Surface, because I have a dual screen monitor system. I've got like a 25-inch and 23, and I made mine touch, and now I'm running Metro. And the funny thing is, I'm seeing some of the news apps. So instead of going to the normal, going to the web to get to like ABC News or whatever, now I can go to the ABC News app and I can go touch and play with it. My wife would love that. So I think there's a compelling reason to consume content in a little different form, but realize it's going to be in a walled garden.
Not directly related to the talk, which was great, by the way, but a Windows 8 question.
Okay, I'll answer it if I can.
Okay.
If not, I'll look.
Well, it's seeking an opinion.
Okay.
I've been saying this for months. I cannot see how they are going to get people to use a touchscreen desktop. I cannot see it still. But Microsoft seems obsessed, bent on getting people to do this all day. How is that going to work?
I have a 23-inch touchscreen. It is a cool screen. And by the way, if I don't ever use it for touch, it's a cool screen.
Not
Well,
for 8
and
hours a day.
right now is, if I was using it for programming, and actually when I was developing this talk, I'm bopping between different screens because really I'm running the Metro and actually ran the simulator most of the time. And I would use touch in the simulator just because I could and it was easy and it was nice for interaction. But on a desktop, you don't need touch, I don't think. The only thing is keyboard's a little annoying. You still have to do mouse and you have to learn those skills, and I think it's a trainable thing. I'm getting happier with it in the beginning. In the beginning, I hated it, but I'm getting to like it better. Touch is much more compelling, and a smaller form factor is better in touch because I'm doing this all the time. I could be, if somebody was around, they weren't paying attention, they think I'm doing some sort of gesture and flipping them off or something. But I think that touch can be compelling under the right form factor. I think laptops, with modest sized screens, touch in particular for like news, you can then use a laptop form, you can use a touch form, you can get the best of both worlds. And then if you really want a smaller form factor, you can go to the pad. But if you go to like the pad style, now you're going to want like the 27, 30-inch monitor, because if you're a developer, I like 2 screens, or I'm going to have a really large screen for screen real estate, because this little thing really isn't going to cut it for programming or much of anything else. I now need a second screen that's large. So I'm not sure. I'm playing with it right now, and if you ever want to, you come by and play with it, and we could see what it's like. But it works. It's cool. If I'm using it for news and poking around and I'm bored to death, it's great. If I'm programming and trying to get work done heads down, no, it's a waste of time, because this and a mouse is small motion. This and touch, is large motion, and it's just too slow. That's my opinion.
Yeah, I have an opinion on that as well. I think we're going to see more kind of compelling designs on touch screens in general. I mean, it's going to help. It's going to help Microsoft with Windows 8, I think. But I think any device coming out, their touch is going to be there, right? I think that like for desktops, you're going to see something where you can tilt it up and you have it with a keyboard for programming or whatever, but then have it tilt down for like a drafting table. Exactly.
And that's like my monitor right now. It's supposed to tilt almost all the way down, but then it's mine's almost too large. It would almost be nice to have 10, 11-inch kind of little one you can poke around and play with, and then have your big screens to do whatever you want. There's going to be a lot of playing around, but Microsoft has an opportunity more than just a pad, more than just a desktop. And if you're seeing it, I think people are playing in the works, and I think the machine I want is not quite there, because I wanted to go buy like a laptop with touch, or a slate that could be used as a laptop, and I haven't found the one that I would be happy with yet. But there are some cool devices.
Yeah, it just seems that the ergonomics hasn't caught up with what they're trying to do with the operating system right now, because I mean, it's going to take a massive paradigm shift in terms of not just, I mean, in terms of hardware, to go along with a paradigm shift in terms of UI, you know. I mean, they have the Surface, which is a pretty cool kind of initial proof of concept, right? And hopefully, you know, other hardware manufacturers will follow suit. But I mean, right now, all I'm seeing in terms of, you know, when I'm, quite frankly, I mean, most of the Windows 8 experience I have is watching the commercials, you know, and you see the, you know, the people with the traditional looking desktop computers reaching out like this, and to me, I just don't see it happen.
Well, I've been
so it's going to have to be, like you said, it's going to have to be something that comes forward or folds under or something, because, I mean, that just goes against everything, every ergonomic principle that we know, right?
Well, there are different paradigms. And again, there might be like a 45-degree type of form where you have a screen and a 45 where you manipulate and then you've got the other screen, or two screens and a manipulate in the middle. Don't know. One thing I do want to say, though, is I hated Windows 8 when I first saw it. I'm getting to like it more. There are some wonderful design features, but the main problem is because of the lack of discoverability, there's habits you have to learn. And in the beginning, we really didn't have a lot of the habits articulated. I was frustrated. Now think about your line of business user. We've used the Windows interface, Windows 95 to Windows 7. Somebody was used to 95 would come today and they'd be amazed at how fast the machines are and how cute it is, but they'd be able to manipulate through that whole paradigm because the apps look the same. Now it's going to be very massively different. People with phone experience and things, or with tablet experiences, it's becoming more similar and it's compelling at the smaller form factor. But it's enough different that think about the trainability of like masses of users who will grumble with any change. They want to know the steps. This for line of business is going to take a while. So I think it's going to hit consumer and then eventually will roll over, but we're not talking about 6 months to a year. People are going to take a while for adoption. I think that there's reasons for it long term, but short term is interesting, or short term is going to be interesting, and that's that interesting times. That's my high horse.
For line of business applications, I'd suggest taking a look at one of the build sessions. There's a case study for line of business apps in WinRT, and they had SAP taking their application
and move it around piecewise.
Correct, and that's essentially what they did. Was instead of creating a single, you know, SAP app, they created multiple apps for different pieces of functionality in, you know, as separate apps in the store. And that's a pretty good session, actually. It kind of shows how they then deal with communication between the apps and that kind of stuff. So,
by the way, war story. Lee would like this. Old days, you had seen Unix and they were software tools, right? Because the systems couldn't do big programs because you could only do little things, and you just combined them up. And the thing was, Unix used to have a lot of just pluggable applications that all worked together to do things. You didn't have a monstrosity of an app. You had tools that you could assemble. Microsoft's going towards that paradigm, and again, you take the old monolithic apps and you can do it a piece at a time. So I'm sorry, I could talk way too much about it, but that was one thing I was going to talk about, and it was one of those extra things I decided to let slide. So in any case, we've talked a long time. If anybody's curious, we'd ask questions. I would love to see if I get this going on Surface and what the experience is with that little web app. But this is a start, and again, I think there's a lot of things in terms of where this should go, but if anybody's interested in taking this little app and playing with it and doing a few small things, I would love it, because I think an SVNUG video player app would be a wonderful thing to do, and I think it's like a weekend kind of project. So in any case, thank you for your time.